What would you do if the most hunted man in the Arizona Territory, a fierce Apache warrior worth $500 dead or alive, collapsed bleeding on your doorstep in the middle of a storm that rattled the heavens? Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. For Ada Boone, a poor widow clinging to survival on the far edge of nowhere, that nightmare came true. Every instinct screamed at her to let the desert finish him. Yet something else. A flicker of pity, defiance, maybe the raw ache of loneliness drove her to pull him inside. It was one reckless act of mercy, a secret she tucked into the walls of her cabin against a land and a people who wanted him gone. She never guessed that choice would spark the desert itself, and one day bring warriors to her door, not for vengeance, but to claim her as a bride. The wind that night in 1878 was no friend, a wild beast clawing at the roof of Ada Boone's tiny cabin. The place was little more than a shack of sod and timber clinging to the rocky edge of the frontier, where the sun scorched hope out of a body, and the coyotes carried whispers on the night air. 2 years had crawled by since fever took her husband Eli Boone, leaving her with 20 acres of stubborn rock, a mule named Clementine, and a loneliness so heavy it pressed on her chest like iron. All day the sky had brooded swollen purple like a battered fist. When the storm broke, it poured with a fury, drowning her land in rivers of mud. Inside, Ada sat by the dim fire, patching a sack with thread, the light cutting shadows into the hollows of her young but weathered face. At 28, she was already carved hard by the West, her softness stolen, replaced with grit. A sudden crash against the door made her flinch, the needle biting her finger. It wasn't the polite knock of a traveler. It was the heavy fall of a body. Fear iced her blood. Her mind leapt to the bounty posters she'd seen nailed at the sheriff's office in Redemption Gulch. They had shown a hard-jawed Apache warrior, his black hair long, his eyes burning with rage that no ink could cage. Nash Red Hawk, they called him the renegade, who had led the Silver Creek raid, left 3 men dead, and the assay office in ashes. $500 for him dead or alive. Enough to buy her passage back east, away from this God-forsaken frontier. Her hand gripped the old Winchester stock, worn smooth by Eli's hands, and now hers. Heart-pounding, she crept to the door, pressed her ear to the wood. Only the storm's howl. Fingers white on the latch, she eased the bar free and pulled the door open. There he was, sprawled in the mud, half drowned by rain. Even in the gloom, she knew him, the buckskin leggings, the beadwork on his arm, the high, sharp cheekbones. The outlaw from the poster. His skin was pale beneath the sun-dark, his tunic torn open, blood spreading black and wide from a bullet hole in his side. His chest rose, shallow, breath ragged. He was dying. Every warning she'd ever learned, every whisper of fear and prejudice told her to slam the door and let the storm finish him. To help was treason. Clay Rourke, the grim sheriff of Redemption Gulch, would hang her just as quick as he'd hang the warrior. Yet Ada stood in the doorway, rain soaking her skirts, wind lashing her hair across her face. She looked at his open hand, strong and calloused, lying helpless in the mud. She looked at his face, not the demon from the poster, but a man broken, bleeding, abandoned to die. And the weight of her solitude made the choice for her. What was left to lose? A patch of cursed dirt, the contempt of neighbors who pitied her at best. With a grunt born of desperation, Ada hooked her arms under his, her back and shoulders screaming as she dragged his dead weight across the threshold. She pulled him inside inch by inch, the mud and blood smearing across her floorboards. She slammed the door against the storm. Suddenly, the cabin, her one refuge, felt like a trap holding the most wanted man in the territory. She stood over him, chest heaving, sage and blood in the air. "Lord, what have I done?" she whispered into the silence. The first day blurred in terror and grit. Ada hauled Nash Red Hawk onto her narrow bed, stripping away his soaked buckskin. The wound was worse than she'd feared, torn raw by a rifle ball fever already burning through him. She worked by candlelight hands, trembling as she poured whiskey on the wound. He flinched, eyes snapping open once, in delirium, black eyes wild and suspicious before rolling shut. She packed the gash with yarrow and leaves her grandmother had taught her to use back in Ohio, binding it tight with strips torn from Eli's old shirt. At any moment she expected him to strike, but fever kept him chained. The secret in her cabin grew heavy, a living thing. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind sounded like the hooves of a posse. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Only sat with the Winchester across her lap, watching his chest rise and fall. On the third day, the fever broke. Ada jolted awake to find him staring at her eyes, sharp and piercing now. There was no thanks in them, only the cold assessment of a cornered wolf measuring whether she was friend or foe. He said nothing. She kept her mouth shut. The air between them was thick as canyon fog, heavy with old grudges and unspoken truths that had scarred two nations. Without a word, Ada Boone dipped her ladle into the pot and held out a spoon of thin broth toward the wounded man. He stared at the spoon, then at her face, jaw clenched. "It's only rabbit broth," she rasped, voice rough from sleepless nights. "You need to eat." He didn't move. She realized he was testing her, waiting to catch a tremor of fear, a crack of weakness. She held the spoon, steady eyes locked on his, refusing to flinch. At last he gave the smallest of nods, almost invisible. She fed him slowly, each spoonful feeling like it could explode the fragile peace between them. The act was strangely intimate, and dangerously so. That afternoon, the sound she'd dreaded arrived, a horse on the trail. Panic slammed through her. Her eyes swept the cramped cabin. No place to hide him. She snatched a blanket and tossed it over his still form on the cot, whispering, "Don't move. Not a sound." Straightening her apron, she drew a shaky breath and opened the door into blinding sunlight. It was Clay Rourke, his stocky frame blotting out the glare as he sat atop his bay mare. Beside him rode his young deputy Roy Cutter, eyes bright with eagerness. "Afternoon," Mrs. Boone, the sheriff, rumbled. He didn't dismount. His small, sharp eyes scanned past her into the shadowed cabin. "Storm, treat you all right?" "It was a bad one." "Sheriff," Ada answered, heart hammering her ribs. She leaned against the doorframe, feigning calm. Took a few shingles, but the roof held. Good to hear, Clay said, though his gaze wasn't on her roof. "We're on patrol. That Apache devil Nash Red Hawk and his band hit a freight wagon at the San Pedro crossing 2 days back. Killed the driver. We tracked them this far before the storm washed out the trail. He spat a dark stream near her step. One of them was hit. Left a blood trail a blind man could follow. You haven't seen anything unusual out this way, have you? A stray horse? A man on foot?" Her blood ran cold. She thought of the bloody smear on her floorboards hidden under the rag rug. "No, Sheriff?" she said, praying the lie didn't tremble in her voice. "Nothing but wind and rain out here. I haven't seen a soul since last week." Roy shifted in his saddle. "Ma'am, Sheriff, I could just take a quick look around the property. Check the shed, no need to trouble yourself." Deputy Ada cut in a shade too fast. "Clementine's the only thing in there, and she's meaner than a cornered badger." Clay Rourke's gaze lingered on her face. She felt sure he saw the flicker of fear in her eyes, the tightness in her shoulders. He was a man who made his living reading people, and she was an open book of terror. Well, he drawled at last. "You keep that rifle handy, Mrs. Boone. If you see anything, send up a smoke signal. That murdering savage is worth $500. A woman like you could do a lot with that kind of money." He tipped his hat without warmth and wheeled his horse. As they rode away, Ada stayed frozen in the doorway, knuckles pressed against her lips, until they whitened. She stumbled back inside, legs weak, and slammed the door. Leaning against it, she trembled uncontrollably. From the cot, the blanket shifted. Nash Red Hawk had pushed it off his face. He had heard every word. His expression was unreadable. For the first time, though, Ada saw something other than suspicion in his eyes, a flicker of respect, a silent acknowledgement of the monumental risk she'd just taken for him. The sheriff's visit changed everything. Her secret was no longer just a weight. It was a blade dangling above her neck. Her land was marked her word suspect. She knew Clay Rourke would be back. In the days that followed, a strange, quiet rhythm settled in. Nash Red Hawk was healing. The fire of infection had burned out, replaced by slow-gathering strength. He moved like a caged predator, patient, stoic, observant. He watched every move she made as she cooked, cleaned, and tended her scraggly garden. He noticed the way she mended the same dress over and over, how she carefully measured out her flour, the constant worry etched on her face. Then he began to move about the cabin, silent despite his size. One morning, Ada found him at her small table, refletching an arrow from his hidden quiver. His hands moved with a graceful economy, the flick of flint shaping feathers mesmerizing to watch. The silence between them thawed not with words, but with small acts. He saw her struggle to split firewood with a dull axe. The next day, he took the axe, sharpening it on a flat river stone until it was razor keen. When he handed it back, their fingers brushed just a brief touch, but electric, a jolt that had nothing to do with fear. Another time, her water barrel ran low. The creek was half a mile, a grueling haul she usually made twice a week. As she reached for the buckets, he rose and took them. "I will go," he said, his voice deep and gravelly from disuse, the first full sentence he'd spoken to her. "You can't," she protested, fear flaring. "They could be watching." "The watchers grow lazy in the midday sun," he said, scanning the horizon from her small window. "They don't watch for a man walking, only one running." Nash Red Hawk's voice carried a calm certainty that both rattled and reassured her. He slipped out into the midday heat, moving with the quiet confidence of a predator who knew the land better than the men hunting him. Less than an hour later, he returned carrying 2 heavy buckets brimming with water, not a single drop spilled. He moved through the wilds like a shadow, where Ada Boone saw only danger. To him, the desert was no enemy. It was home. One evening, as she salted down a rabbit to keep for leaner days, he spoke again, his voice low and steady. "Your man," he said, nodding toward the cabin's rough beams. "Where is he?" Ada's hands stilled. "He's gone," she whispered, eyes fixed on her work. "Fever. 2 years ago." Nash was silent a long while. Finally, he said, "He built this place." "He did," Ada answered. "Eli Boone was a fine carpenter, but not much of a farmer." A sad little smile touched her lips. "This land is hard. The land is not hard," Nash corrected softly. "The people bring the hardness." His dark gaze fixed on her, sharp as an arrowhead. "Why do you stay?" The question cut deep. It was the same one she asked herself each lonely night. "I've got nowhere else," she admitted, her voice breaking. "This is all I have." "You helped me," he said flatly, not asking but trying to understand. "For that the sheriff would hang you. Your own people would cast you out." "Why? Her heart twisted with the truth she had never dared speak aloud. Finally, she met his eyes. "Because when you were lying on my porch, you looked as lonely as I feel." The words hung raw between them. In his dark eyes, she saw something shift, a recognition, as if he could see straight through her soul. He, the hunted warrior, and she, the scorned widow. They were both exiles unwanted in a world that had no place for them. A week later, Ada's flour bin scraped empty. The salt was nearly gone, beans down to a handful. Dread knotted her stomach as she hitched Clementine to the wagon. "Don't go," Nash warned. His tone was hard as iron. "Clay Rourke will be watching." "I have to," she insisted. "We've got nothing left to eat. I'll be careful." The 2-hour ride into Redemption Gulch felt endless under the pitiless sun. The moment she arrived, she felt the shift. The town had always been cold, but now it was openly hostile. Eyes followed her as she walked to May Hollis's general store. Women who once nodded now turned away. May's smile was sweet as vinegar. "Ada, dear," she said, leaning on the counter. "We worried after that storm. Sheriff Rourke said he stopped by. Such a lonely patch of land you've got. Anything could happen." The barb cut sharper than a knife. Ada forced a weary smile. "The Lord provides May." Desi May's eyes narrowed. "Strange. Buying so much flour and 2 tins of coffee. Didn't think you drank coffee since Eli passed. I've developed a taste," Ada lied, cheeks burning. She paid with trembling hands, feeling every eye in the store bore into her back. As she loaded the wagon, Clay Rourke stepped out of his office across the street. He didn't move toward her, just stood there, arms crossed, his stare heavy as a gallows rope. The message was clear. "We know. We're watching. And we'll be waiting." The ride home was a torment of shadows and whispers. Relief nearly broke her knees when she saw smoke curling from her chimney. Nash met her at the door, wordless, taking the heavy sacks from her arms. His grim face told her he had read the fear trembling through her bones. That night she sat before the fire, staring into the flames. He lowered himself to the floor beside her chair, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "My name is not only Nash Red Hawk. Among my people, it is Binley Clini." "What does it mean?" she asked quietly. "It means the one who sees beyond." He gazed into the fire shadows dancing across his eyes. He told her of Silver Creek, how miners had stolen something sacred, a stone carved with the story of creation taken from a holy place. "We did not ride for gold," he said. "We rode to reclaim what was ours. They fired first." Ada listened, realizing he was giving her a gift, his truth. Not a confession of murder, but the heart of a man fighting for his people's soul. Then he turned his voice low and fierce. "I see beyond the widow's worn hands and the dust on her dress. I see a woman with the heart of a warrior. You've faced down your enemies and did not break." Ada's breath caught. No one had ever called her that. Eli had called her delicate. The townsfolk called her poor Ada Boone. But this fugitive saw a strength she had forgotten she had. In the fire's glow amid a world that despised them both, an impossible bond was being forged. And as Nash Red Hawk's wound healed, the air in the cabin grew thick with a new tension. Something unspoken, powerful, and alive. Nash Red Hawk was like a panther trapped in a box, too much strength, too much fire for the tiny cabin to hold. He would stand for hours at the window, staring out across the distant mesas, his face marked with a hunger for freedom. Ada Boone knew he couldn't stay yet. The thought of losing him and falling back into her crushing solitude was a pain she could hardly bear. Life between them had settled into a rhythm that felt almost like a household. He taught her things no book could: how to read the land to tell healing plants from poison, how to move with silence, how to listen to the cries of birds as warnings when strangers approached. In return, she read to him from the old Bible by her bedside. He wasn't drawn to the faith, but to the words, the poetry, the stories of exile and survival. One evening, he laid a gift in her hands, a tiny bird carved from juniper wood. Its lines were simple, but true. "For the woman who feeds the birds," he said, remembering how she left crumbs on the sill each morning. Her fingers shook as she took it. It was the first gift she'd been given since Eli Boone had died. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "In my people's way," he said softly, "when a man carves for a woman, it means he sees her spirit. It means honor." The moment was almost too much to hold. They stood close, silence, heavy with what neither dared speak. His hand rose as if to touch her cheek, then fell. The gulf between their worlds, race-blood history, yawned wide. But danger crept not from him, but from someone she'd thought harmless. Jed Coulter, the blacksmith in Redemption Gulch, had always shown Ada a quiet kindness. He'd reshod Clementine for free after Eli passed, and gave her fair trade for her meager bits of metal. Yet out hunting one afternoon, Jed saw smoke curling from the ravine behind Ada's place. Not chimney smoke, but the faint kind made by a man hiding from the law. Jed wasn't cruel, but he was practical. He knew the tales about Nash Red Hawk knew Sheriff Clay Rourke had eyes on Ada. And he knew harboring a fugitive could light the whole territory aflame. His conscience gnawed at him all the way back to town until he told Rourke what he'd seen. The next morning, Nash was checking snares when a flash of sunlight off steel caught his eye. He melted into the shadows of the junipers, heart pounding. 6 riders led by Clay Rourke himself were closing in, moving slow and deliberate. Nash ran silent moccasins, whispering over hard earth, and burst into the cabin. "They're coming," he said, voice tight. 6 men, from the east. Ada went pale. Her hands flew to her mouth. "What do we do?" "I leave," he answered simply. Grabbing bow and quiver, he fixed her with a steady look. "Go outside. Act normal. You were tending your garden. You saw nothing." "Where will you go?" she gasped. "To the Black Range, to my people." He paused at the door, regret in his eyes. "You were brave for me, Ada Boone. I will not forget it." Her voice broke. "Nash." For the first time, his hand touched her fingers, brushing her cheek. It was a touch heavy with farewell and promises too large for this world. "I will return," he vowed, not as a question, but as a solemn oath. Then he was gone, slipping into the ravine, part of the land itself. Ada forced her trembling legs to carry her outside. She bent in her patch of withered vegetables, hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped the trowel. The thunder of hooves came before the men appeared. Clay Rourke and his posse poured into her yard, surrounding the cabin missus. Boone Rourke bellowed as he swung down. "We know he's here. Give him up now and maybe it'll go easier on you." Ada rose slowly, her face drained of color, but stiff with resolve. "Sheriff, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play me for a fool, woman," he roared, his face purple with rage. Roy Cutter and the others leveled their rifles at the cabin. Jed Coulter saw smoke. Clay spat. "We're done playing games." He shoved past her boot, crashing the door open. His men tore through her meager home, tossing aside what little she owned. They found nothing, only a pot of cold rabbit broth on the hearth and the carved bird lying unnoticed on the floor. When Rourke stormed back out, his face was black with fury. He was here. I can smell it. He seized Ada's arm in a bruising grip, his fingers digging deep. "Where did he go?" "I don't know what you're talking about, Ada." Boone repeated her voice, trembling, but steady fear clashing with a sudden flare of defiance. "You're a liar," Clay Rourke spat, shoving her aside. "You're a traitor to your own kind. We didn't catch him today, but we will. And when we drag the truth out of him, we'll be back for you." He swung into his saddle, his glare promising ruin. "You're on your own now, Mrs. Boone. Let's see how you and your Apache-loving soul survive out here alone." The posse thundered off, leaving Ada in the dust, staring at the wreckage of her ransacked home. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm she had ever weathered. Nash was gone. The secret was out. She was utterly, brutally alone. His vow to return felt like a dying ember swallowed by the cold wind. It wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of her trial by fire. Clay Rourke, enraged at losing his prey, kept his promise in another way. He couldn't jail her, no proof, but he could crucify her in the only court that mattered, the whispers of Redemption Gulch settlers. Word spread like wildfire. Ada Boone was no widow to be pitied. She was an Indian lover, a traitor who harbored Nash Red Hawk. The tale was simple, ugly, and believed without question. She had chosen a savage over her own people. The next time she went to town, the punishment was merciless. No one met her eyes. Doors slammed. Conversations died as she walked past. In May Hollis's general store, the hush was thick enough to choke on. May stood stiff behind the counter, arms crossed, face hard. "We don't serve your kind here," she said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "May, I just need flour," Ada pleaded, humiliation burning her cheeks. "I have money. Your money's no good here. Get out." She left empty-handed, the glares and whispers cutting deeper than knives. At the forge, Jed Coulter kept his eyes fixed on the anvil hammer ringing hard and final. He, the man who had betrayed her, now hid his guilt beneath anger. Her isolation was complete. She was an island surrounded by scorn. As summer gave way to autumn, her supplies dwindled. The garden withered. She tried to hunt, but snares yielded nothing. Hunger gnawed at her daily. Nights grew longer, colder, longer. She chopped wood with blistered hands, patched the roof, fought the wind, and battled despair until the cabin itself felt like a prison. The silence inside was no longer peace. It was a void filled with the memory of Nash Red Hawk's presence and the echo of his promise. "I will return." Those words became her mantra, a fragile prayer whispered into the dark. Yet when the first snows dusted, the Black Range hope felt like folly. Why would he risk his life for her, a forgotten widow, when he was free among his people? Their days together seemed like a fever dream, born of loneliness. Winter came savage. A blizzard buried her cabin for a week. She survived on beans and melted snow, her world reduced to 4 walls, and the howl of the wind. She grew thin, her clothes hanging loose. Day by day, her strength was chipped away, until she felt herself becoming a ghost. One bitter afternoon in late January, with only a handful of beans left, and the woodpile nearly gone, Ada sat, bundled in every blanket she owned, rocking slowly, eyes fixed on the endless white outside. Her thoughts drifted to Eli Boone, to their lost dream of a good life in the West, to her family in Ohio, who likely thought her dead. And then to Nash, his dark eyes, the touch of his hand against her cheek. Was it worth this slow starvation, endless solitude? For the first time, she wondered if it was easier just to stop fighting, let the cold take her quietly. Then movement caught her eye on the ridge. At first, she thought her weary mind was playing tricks, conjuring phantoms in the snow. But the shapes sharpened into riders, one, then another, and another, until a long line emerged from the trees. These weren't lawmen. They were Chiricahua warriors, mounted on sturdy horses, their breath white in the frigid air. Wolf pelts draped their shoulders, lances feathered with eagle plumes in hand. They moved with the silent power of a storm, fearsome and magnificent. At their head rode a man taller than the rest, a figure she knew even at a distance. Nash Red Hawk. Her heart thought frozen, leapt with such force it stole her breath. He had kept his promise. He had returned. But not alone. He had not returned alone. Nash Red Hawk brought his warriors with him. Ada's first rush of relief froze into terror as she glanced from the riders cresting the ridge to the thin ribbon of smoke curling up from Redemption Gulch in the valley below. Her heart turned cold. He hadn't come back for her. He had come back for war. And she stood square in his path. Down in the valley, the town saw them too. The sharp clang of the church bell split the frigid air, a cry reserved only for fire or attack. The saloon doors swung wide. Men and women spilled into the street, pale with fear. It was their worst nightmare, Chiricahua warriors riding hard out of the hills. Sheriff Clay Rourke scrambled barking orders to a scattering of nervous men, fumbling with their rifles. "They've come for the woman," someone shouted. "It's her fault." But the warriors didn't charge the town. They passed it by moving with grim purpose straight toward Ada's lonely cabin. Their horses circled her yard like a river cutting a wide loop, bridles jingling softly, breath steaming in the cold. Ada stood frozen on the porch, the old Winchester loose in her hands. Surrounded. No place to run. Nash swung down from his horse, his movements sure and commanding. He was not the half-dead fugitive she'd nursed months ago. Now he wore ceremonial buckskin, stitched with quill work, a lance in his hand, every inch the image of a leader. He stepped forward, moccasins silent on the snow, and stopped just short of the porch. His dark gaze locked on hers, carrying the weight of months apart, and the promise he had sworn. Ada Boone. His voice carried clear in the frozen air. Behind him, 2 warriors led forward a string of fine horses, broad-chested American stock, taken in raids. Another laid down a heap of thick woven blankets, their colors bright against the snow. Ada stared, bewildered. This wasn't an attack. This was something else. Something ceremonial. "What is this?" she whispered hoarsely. "In my people's way," Nash said, never breaking eye contact, "when a man chooses his mate, he proves he can provide. He shows her kin and his tribe that she will be honored, that she will never know hunger or cold again. This is the bride price." The words struck her like a hammer. His mate. Bride price. Her mind reeled. He had not come to burn or to avenge. He had come for her. "I have no family to give it to," she stammered, overwhelmed. "You are your own family," he said, the hint of a smile ghosting his lips. "You are a clan of one. I offer it to you." He took another step closer. "I told you I saw a warrior's heart in you. My people need such a woman. I need such a woman. Come stand beside me. Be honored as my wife." It was an impossible choice, like something torn from legend. To go meant leaving everything she had ever known and stepping into a world her people called savage. To stay meant certain ruin, starvation, or the vengeance of her own town. As if to drive the point home, a cloud of dust and snow rose in the distance. Clay Rourke and a dozen armed men were riding hard rifles, ready, grim faces set. They would not allow this to stand. C. Nash murmured, though his eyes never left Ada's. "Your world cast you out long ago. They come not to save you, but to claim you to punish you for daring to see a man where they see only a beast." He extended his hand. "My world offers you a home. The choice is yours. But you must make it now." The posse reined in their horses 20 yards out, rifles raised. Sheriff Rourke's face was twisted with rage. "Hey," he bellowed. "Get away from him! Get back here now!" Ada looked from Rourke's contorted face to Nash's steady hand. 2 paths opened before her, one back to Redemption Gulch, to scorn and solitude. The other into the wild, into the unknown, with the one man who had truly seen her. Her decision was not born of reason. It came from the hollow place inside her that had hungered not only for bread, but for respect, for connection, for life itself. She had been the poor widow Boone too long. Deliberately, she lowered the Winchester onto the porch boards. Drawing a breath that seared her lungs with cold, she stepped down the stairs and placed her trembling hand into Nash's strong, warm grip. A roar of fury erupted from the posse. "She's with him!" Traitor Nash's hand tightened on hers. His eyes stayed only on her. "Are you certain?" he asked, voice low. "Once you ride with me, there is no turning back." "There is nothing to turn back to," Ada answered, her voice clear as the winter air. And with that, her fate was sealed. The moment Ada Boone took Nash Red Hawk's hand, the world split into 2, the furious red-faced lawman and his posse on one side, and on the other, a life in the wilderness, with the man who had honored her above all others. The rifles that only moments before had been held with certainty now trembled ever so slightly, the posse's confidence crumbling under the weight of her choice. The only steady thing in that frozen standoff was the warm, unyielding grip of Nash Red Hawk's hand around Ada Boone's fingers, an anchor against the storm of her life. Silence pressed heavy, broken only by the restless snort of horses and the sharp, startled breath of Roy Cutter. He was just a boy, hardly grown his beard, no more than shadows, his wide eyes reflecting the same confusion swirling inside Ada. Sheriff Clay Rourke shattered the stillness, his rage exploding in a voice that cracked across the snow. "So that's it. You choose that filth over your own kind, after he murdered our people." The words were meant to cut to shame her back into submission. But Nash's reply came quiet, steady, carrying farther than Rourke's roar. "Your people died because they stole from a sacred place, and because they fired first. They chose their fight. Sheriff, your quarrel is with me, not with her." He shifted his stance, placing himself more squarely between Ada and the rifles aimed her way, a living shield of flesh and bone. His eyes darkened, his voice sharpening like steel. "She is under my protection now. She is one of the people. To harm her is to declare war on the Chiricahua warriors, a war you will not survive." It wasn't a boast. It was truth heavy as stone. The weight of it settled on the posse, ordinary men with shops and farms, with wives and children. The thrill of chasing one fugitive soured into the terror of starting a war that would burn their town to ashes and turn their names into cautionary tales. They looked at the silent wall of warriors standing behind Nash men, born of this land, men whose faces carried maps of battles fought and endured. And in that moment, the posse saw their own mortality staring back. Ada felt the change. The bravado drained, replaced by calculation. The standoff was over before it began. This was Nash's world, and they had stepped into it. He turned to her, then guiding her toward a black mare whose coat gleamed like obsidian against the snow. The saddle was a blend of Apache and Mexican craftsmanship built for endurance and war. He set his strong hands at her waist, and in an instant Ada remembered him broken on her cot near death. Now he lifted her lightly as if she weighed nothing, placing her in the saddle with care. It was a declaration for her, for his warriors, for her enemies, that she belonged with him now. He mounted his own gray stallion, a magnificent beast coiled with energy. Taking her reins in his hand, Nash gave one last, unreadable glance toward Clay Rourke. No triumph, no pity, only a distance too wide to cross. Then his voice rang out sharp and clear, not a cry for war, but the call of departure. As one, the Chiricahua warriors wheeled their mounts. No chaos, no panic, just the perfect, practiced grace of men who had survived by discipline. They formed around Nash and Ada, a living shield of muscle hide and will. They moved out, proud and deliberate, not retreating, departing, leaving behind a world of smaller men. Ada refused to look back. She would not give Rourke or the townsfolk the satisfaction of seeing doubt in her eyes. She would not glance at the lonely cabin where she had buried Eli Boone and nursed a broken warrior back to strength. That book was closed. Instead, she fixed her gaze on the vast wilderness ahead. The wind was sharp on her face, but for the first time in years, it didn't feel like an enemy trying to grind her down. It felt like cleansing, stripping away grief, loneliness, and despair. She was riding out of a quiet death and into something unknown, but fiercely alive. The hours stretched long, the sun sinking low, painting the snowy plains in fire and gold. The enormity of her choice sank into her bones. Around her, the warriors rode in silence, a wall of vigilance. She studied them the way they scanned the ridges, the way their hands spoke in small, silent gestures, the unity of their movement. They were not the savage caricatures of dime novels. They were her guardians. One older warrior, his face as weathered as red rock, caught her eyes. He didn't smile, but gave her a slow nod, acknowledgement, maybe even respect. They weren't just following their chief. They were escorting his chosen woman. By twilight, Nash reined in. They had climbed to a ridge overlooking a vast valley ringed by towering mesas. The air was thinner here, crisp and still. He dismounted, came to her side, and helped her down with surprising gentleness. "This is our land," he said, his voice low, carrying in the quiet. He swept his arm wide at the valley below. "You will be safe here." Ada followed his gaze. Fires winked to life in the growing, dark, warm, orange embers scattered like fallen stars among the wickiups. Voices carried on the wind the faint lilt of a song, a child being lulled to sleep. It was a living world, a home. But not her home. The beauty struck her like a knife, filling her with fear, as raw as it was sudden. "Nash," she whispered, her voice frayed. "I don't know your ways. I don't speak your tongue," Ada Boone whispered, glancing down at her pale hands, at the worn calico dress clinging to her frame, a stark contrast to his buckskin, his beads, his feathers. "Here, too, I'll be an outcast. They'll see me for what I am, a white woman, an enemy." Nash listened without interruption. When she finished, he reached for her hand, his thumb brushing gently across her knuckles. His voice softened, carrying only for her. "My name," he said, "is Nash Red Hawk. Among my people, they call me the one who sees beyond." He tilted her chin, forcing her to meet the depth of his gaze. "When I look at you, I don't see a white woman. I see the one who dragged her enemy bleeding out of a storm. I see the woman who faced down a sheriff's rifle to protect him. I see the woman who laid her weapon aside and walked away from everything she knew for a future she could not even imagine." He stepped closer, his presence warm against the chill of night. My people honor courage above all things. They saw you today. They saw how you defied the men who cast you out. They saw how you chose your own path. Their respect is already yours. You need not beg for it. It is earned. For the first time, he smiled fully, the rare expression softening the hard lines of his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. Learning our ways, our words, that will come. That will be our journey together. I will teach you. You will not be an outcast. His voice dropped lower, intimate. You will be my wife. Ada's eyes drifted from his face to the valley below, where fires glimmered like fallen stars scattered across the earth. The songs of families drifted faintly on the air, a lullaby in a language she did not know. It was foreign, yes. It was bound in blood and history against her people. But it was a world that had not turned her away, a world that had given her a place when her own had left her for dead. For the first time since Eli Boone had drawn his last breath, Ada felt something stir in her chest. Hope. A fragile warmth rising from within, not from a hearthfire, but from the promise of belonging. Her past was a ghost now, a hollow echo across a barren prairie. Her future stood here in the heart of the Apache nation, under a sky of unfamiliar stars, on the edge of a life she could never have dreamed. The tale of Ada Boone and Nash Red Hawk is not just another story of the Old West. It is a story of lines drawn between peoples and the rare courage it takes to cross them. It is proof that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery aren't found on battlefields, but in the quiet, desperate choices of the human heart. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.